So it seems that there's very big changes indeed for Warhammer 40k's new psychic system. The phase itself is gone, it looks like rolling to cast and deny is history, and damage output is no longer tied to mortal wounds. Loads of big changes, plus a couple of new psychic datasheets, so let's take a look at what we've got. Hello and welcome back to Warspec Tactics, where today we're talking psychic changes to 10th edition Warhammer. Games Workshop have just dropped a new preview article, basically outlining how the psychic system would be changing, something that I was really quite interested to see, given that they said that the psychic phase would basically be gone from the game and rolled into other phases. First up, they've given us a preview of 40k's new battle round. It goes command phase, movement phase, shooting phase, charge phase, and fight phase. Still sticking to the classic I go you go system. Nothing weird like alternating activations yet at least, though it does sound like Games Workshop have been trying to give more nods to keeping both players engaged regardless of whose turn it is, with a whole bunch of reactive mechanics on datasheets and other places. Otherwise though, no other really weird phase shake-ups here. Looks like we're just sticking to the standard system, movement, shooting and assault. As well as the psychic phase, the morale phase has also gone. Hopefully I'll be trying to talk about those changes in the next video on the channel, so feel free to subscribe or check back later if you'd like to see that. But first up I thought we'd focus on the psychic phase itself, where it does look like the psychers are going to be doing all manner of different things in 40k, though loads of the current mechanics are just entirely gone. Currently throughout 8th and 9th edition 40k, 40k's had a psychic phase that happened after movement but before shooting. And to be honest, the location of the phase was kind of interesting in itself. It meant that you had to do all of your psychic attacks before you got to fire anything, which could maybe mess with target priority a bit, if say you smited something and then you couldn't see it with your shooting attacks. But the location of the phase was actually kind of helpful for things like some command benefits. It meant that say you could get out of a transport, then cast a psychic power, whereas if it was a command phase thing, you wouldn't be able to do it as you were still in a transport at that point. For selecting psychic powers, models generally get to select psychic powers out of a table of 6 within their codex. You can have multiple copies of the same psychic power running around on the battlefield, but only one model can cast it each turn. In general, I thought that was a fairly good system to incentivize you to take some psychers, but not all of them, as generally you got some slightly diminishing returns after the first psychers took some of the better spells, and then the next ones were left with slightly more suboptimal picks. You currently need a psychic test of 2d6 to activate powers, and the opponent can try and deny them with their own psychers within 24 inches. Could be an interesting little duel of wizards in armies that have both of them. And overall I would say that the phase works kind of well at the moment throughout 8th and 9th. I feel like particularly in 7th and before, the psychic phase went through all manner of variations, most of which just didn't really seem to be enormously popular amongst fans. Particularly the whole warp charge dice system and random spell rolling in 7th edition was a particular low point. You had bunches of psychers just being used as psychic batteries for other casters, and you'd often want to spam loads of psychers so you'd have a better chance of rolling the right spells, and even then you might get unlucky. For the most part, I haven't seen too many complaints about the psychic phase in 8th and 9th. In general I think it did what it did okay. Simple enough rules, and an ability for your opponent to have a bit of counterplay without just ruining psychic armies' best stuff. Obviously it's not a phase that's relevant to every army just by its very nature, but I think it was kind of fine enough for some armies to have a big focus on it, and some not to, and more rely on things like shooting and assault. That brings us to today's changes though, and from Games Workshop's preview it really does imply that a massive amount of the psychic phase is just getting torn out entirely. They don't really 100% confirm that these mechanics are gone in their article, but by the way that the psychic abilities work on their datasheets, there's no indication that they're ever cast or anything like that. There's no warp charge values listed or anything like that. It does appear that things like psychic tests are completely gone. Either the powers just happen if they're on a datasheet, or if they're a powerful ability, you might need to roll a set dice roll. It seems that by that same effect, Deny the Witch is gone. The Space Marine Librarian has a psychic hood, and it doesn't look like that's any way that he can affect other psychers' abilities with that, besides if his actual unit is actually targeted by psychic damage. As a result, it looks like Perils of the Warp is gone as well. It looks like the two psychers that we have previewed will take some damage if they roll the wrong thing, but that's not necessarily going to be the case on every psychic power that they have. It looks to be something that's just going to be special to each datasheet and not just one generic system. We have seen the new rules for Smite, but it looks like it's no longer a generic Smite attack. The Librarian gets it, but the Weirdboy doesn't. He gets his own variety of a different sort of witchfire. Librarians were always the ones that could use the smite power in previous editions of 40k. It looks like each psyker might get its own psychic power, and your standard D3 mortal wounds on a 5+ is gone. In 10th edition, they have confirmed that all the rules will be on the datasheets. There's not going to be a central section of rules for the codex, so the psykers are only going to get the powers that they have listed there. Again, neither the Librarian nor the Weirdboy has any choice in the powers that they can take. They just get the one aggressive power and the one buff each. Unfortunately, no way to choose between the buffing power being something like a defensive power or an offensive power. It's just the one rule. Finally, it does seem that not every single psychic power is basically one per army anymore. Again, out of the two that we've got previewed, which we'll go through in a second, it looks like some psychic powers are only able to be casted once per army, but others you can have affecting multiple squads. It does seem that it's no longer a set rule that you can only cast each power once. It's going to vary depending on how powerful that ability is. Overall, it's a massive simplification of the psychic phase, lots of rolling chopped out, and psykers are maybe going to be a bit more equivalent to any other leader maybe, which I guess has positives for simplicity, though it looks like the majority of the tactics around this phase of the game are going to be pretty simple now. Next up, from the previews, it looks like many abilities that the Psykers get are basically kind of passive buffs that you don't need to roll to activate. The Space Marine Librarian has one that's just automatically on, the Orc player has to roll a 2+ to activate theirs, and it looks like buffing powers that they have normally will usually just affect the unit that they're leading. After all, characters are going to have to join units now. They're not just going to be standing just beside them. It means that, say, if you had a Space Marine Librarian, he's just going to be using his Veil of Time buff on the own Space Marine unit that he's got. He's not going to have the choice to cast that, say, on a nearby unit of bikers. It's only going to be the unit that he's with. Again, it's basically going to be a bit like buying an upgrade for the unit more than anything else. Pay the points for the character and attach them pre-game, and then you get those buffs if you need them. Again, no indication that these are going to either need a psychic test to activate or have a chance for the opponent to deny them. I guess that might be kind of powerful for buffs, as it means that there's going to be less counterplay to them. They're just going to happen. Buffs and debuffs might always be on, like the Librarian one, or might be locked to an individual phase. Apparently, the Genestealer cult will get a mass hypnosis one for debilitating enemies in the fight phase, and the Orky jump one happens in the movement phase. Next up, it looks like psychic weapons will also grant profiles for both shooting and melee attacks. It looks like both attacks like Smite and other witchfires will gain the psychic keyword. At the moment, it just looks like that keyword is going to primarily be relevant just for enemy units having defenses against it, and you get the keyword if you're casting Warp Lightning with Smite, or if you've got a force weapon that's psychically activated. I guess it'll be far less potent against certain foes than others. The damage output for the melee doesn't seem to be too enormously changed, but ranged damage attacks in 8th and 9th edition have generally always been mortal wounds through psychic powers. It now seems that Games Workshop have decided to drop that. Different psychic powers will basically have different weapon profiles just the same as everything else, and while mortal wounds are a part of the game, it's no longer going to be the case that literally every psychic shooting attack does a mortal wound damage, so it kind of means that psykers might be a bit better against things like hordes. Generally, tying all the damage to mortal wounds would have far more value against big heavy units with high saves and strong defenses compared with cheap chaff. These psychic shooting attacks will be able to be shot as well as any weapons that the unit has. They aren't going to replace them. Finally, for Perils of the Warp, it looks like it has been replaced by a fair few datasheet specific risks. A few empowered versions of psychic shooting attacks that we've seen so far get a rule called hazardous attacks. This looks like it's going to be taking mortal wounds in a similar sort of way to plasma weapons, and it looks like the Orky one, in maybe slightly chaotic Orky style, has got a big chance to damage their own unit with a bunch of mortal wounds. If that kind of rule becomes generalised on other powerful powers like Da Jump, it could make Psykers seriously risky to have backfire against you. Still though, it looks like the days of rolling a 1-1 or 6-6 are kind of over. Overall, it's a whole ton of different changes, so let's see them in action. First up, Games Workshop have been kind enough to give us the data slates for the Librarian that we saw the other day, the new guy with the Force Axe and the Stormbolter from the trailer. As a Librarian, his psychic shooting attack is Smite. I'd guess that probably all the Space Marine Librarians will get access to this, but I'd guess that the other psychers of different factions will have their Smite have their own special rules, a different name, and a different way of using it. Again, no apparent hints of any sort of psychic test on this. You basically just fire it as a shooting attack as you would normally. You get to choose either whether it is fired as a standard witchfire or a focused witchfire, which gives you a damage buff, but also the hazardous keyword with the chance to take damage yourself. Regular Smite has got a 24-inch range, D6 shots at strength 5, AP 1, and damage D3. Definitely a little bit less universal than just some flat mortal wounds would have been, but it seems like it's an okay anti-infantry attack. Overall, it usually averages around about 0.7 dead Space Marines, so a bit less than 1 per turn, but won't be particularly powerful against things like vehicles. Otherwise, it's got the focus mode as well. If you choose to activate this and risk taking some damage, it gets +1 strength to 6, AP -2 rather than AP 1, and that devastating hit special rule that we saw in the assault cannon, that one's the one that 6s to wounds generate mortal wounds instead of the damage output, so a 6 to wound here would give you D3 mortal wounds and the attack sequence ends. This one's really not too bad a damage increase, it averages you 1.2 dead Space Marines rather than 0.7, but it does mean that you gain the hazardous keyword, and while they didn't tell us exactly what this one would be, they very heavily implied it would be the same rule as the plasma weapons, saying that it would kill standard infantry if they used it, but for characters and bigger models, each time they trigger it, they have the chance to take a mortal wound. I'd guess that that's probably going to be mortal wounds on a hit roll of 1, as it is currently. Means that if you do trigger the focus smite mode, you will be probably taking some damage on your librarian. You'd average around about 1 mortal wound every 2 times of triggering it, and perhaps for the damage increase that isn't actually that impressive. Overall, at least for the librarian, I'd argue that smite is maybe a little bit toned down. It's going to be quite nice at dealing with light and medium infantry, but definitely a lot less universal against more armoured things. Next up, I thought we'd just take a look at the force weapon, which doesn't really seem to have changed very much besides gaining the psychic keyword. Again, I guess that this is probably just due to any models with psychic defences, such as the librarian himself. I suspect that force weapons will be less effective against certain foes. The profile for it is 4 attacks hitting on 3s at strength 6, AP 1 and damage D3. This is pretty much the exact profile I would have expected the Force Axe to have in 10th edition. It's still got the D3 damage, still got the strength 6, but the AP has been worsened by 1 as we saw with the Terminator's power sword. I was wondering if this guy specifically might get a bit of a damage boost, as it looks like he could potentially double-handed wield the weapon, but it seems they've stuck with the standard Force Axe profile. Then for his actual psychic buff, we've got Veil of Time. Again, I was kind of wondering whether or not he'd have multiple different psychic powers to choose from on his datasheet, and he could just choose one of the buffs to use each turn. But it looks like the default for Psychers is just going to be 1 buffing ability and 1 Witchfire. This one's one of the classic Space Marine psychic powers, and in this iteration it's basically a simple flat damage buff without really any fancy things going on. The unit gets the Sustained Hits 1 special rule, so every hit roll of a 6 gets an additional hit on the opponent. Usually for Space Marines that's going to be a plus 25% damage increase, and it applies to the squad that he's leading, not any squads nearby. Again, like the rest here, no mention that it's going to be cast in any one phase or anything, it just looks like it's always on if he's attached to the unit. Maybe it just feels a little bit bland, it's not particularly unnatural or anything weird, just that pretty much the same sort of damage output boost that you get for a captain or a lieutenant, but in a different form. I'd guess that with this one being quite so simplified, quite a lot of psychic powers might have been lost over multiple codexes. Apparently the Space Marines will get a fair amount of variation between their different librarians that they can field. I'd imagine the Phobos and maybe the standard Primaris one might have their own psychic powers, but I guess it might be worse for other factions that maybe only have one psyker, perhaps like the Leagues of Votan. I'd imagine that they're going to lose the vast majority of their discipline if they're only going to get 1 buffing power on their datasheets. Lastly, for his main psychic rules, we've also got his psychic hood. Currently this one gives you a small bonus to deny powers up close. It's maybe a little bit niche when it comes up, but now again it's pretty much no mention of denying powers, it's just literally a defensive boost for the unit that he happens to lead. They get a 4+ feel no pain type save against psychic attacks. It means that if he was attacked by another librarian using smite or a force weapon against him, his unit would basically have double the durability against those kind of attacks. Really quite a nice benefit for a unit that he's leading. I guess how actually important this is going to be would depend on how prevalent psychers are in the game and how powerful their psychic attacks are. In general though, maybe doesn't seem the worst idea for a unit of Terminators, another very nice durability layer to add to their unit, though whether or not it's better than having a different character lead them, we'll have to wait and see. Overall though, currently the Librarian looks like he'll deal a little bit of extra shooting damage, mainly against medium infantry. And in terms of buffing his units, give them a flat damage boost, plus a bit of defense against psychic damage attacks. We do have another Psychic datasheet previewed, but just while we're on the Librarian, I thought I'd just quickly mention this Combi Weapon profile as well. This one's kind of interesting, as it's the first one that we've seen like this. And again, like things like the standardized power weapon and bolt rifles that don't have alternate variants anymore, this one looks like it could just be a generic profile for combi weapons for Space Marines overall. The profile is pretty weird, to be honest. It's basically a single bolter shot profile, rapid fire 1 at 24-inch range, and it happens to hit on a 4+, I guess taking a ballistic skill penalty for the extra abilities it has. Weirdly though, this time rather than having a second profile that you also fire at the same time, this one just gets the one generic profile, also gaining the anti-infantry 4+ special rule and the devastating wound special rule as well. So I guess we'll always wound infantry, even big ones, on a 4+, and if you get that 6 then it gets immortal wounds instead of its regular damage. My guess is that this combi weapon is on this Librarian's profile as it's the generic Librarian and Terminator armor datasheet, and it'll represent the one with the combi weapon that Games Workshop also sells. It doesn't look like this gun is also on that Librarian and Terminator armor from the new box set. Overall though, it's a pretty big shake-up to combi weapons. Looks like they might all be consolidated into a single profile that's kind of general purpose. Might be bad news for things like Stern Guards with mass combi plasma or combi flamers dropping down. They're going to be far more of a fancy anti-infantry option now, as opposed to a unit that's just going to be able to obliterate tanks with melter. Again, maybe a slightly strange change there. It'll be weird having things like combi flamers and combi melters fire with exactly the same profile, if that really is what this represents. Next up though, with our other Psychic preview, we've also got the Orc Weirdboy. I'll try and make a video that's actually focusing on this datasheet and talking through the Orky things, but for now I thought we'd just focus on his two Psychic powers, Ed Banger and Da Jump. For the purposes of Psychic, Ed Banger kind of shows that different characters will get different Psychic attacks, they don't all get Smite, and this one is kind of interesting. It's got 24-inch range, just a single shot that hits on a 4+, so it isn't particularly reliable. At base strength 6, AP -3 and damage 1. However though, I guess the idea would be to put him in a great big squad full of boys. When he's leading a unit, you get to add 1 to the strength and damage characteristic of the attack for each 5 models in the unit. So I guess if we can still take boys in great big mobs of 30, you could theoretically get all the way up to strength 12 and damage 7. Though I guess it's kind of possible that it might decrease the top unit cap down to 20 or something. If there's a good number of models in the unit, it also gets the hazardous keyword, so I'd guess that will be a mortal wound on a 1 to hit. Maybe not the end of the world there, but it also looks like it gets the precision keyword as well, and I suspect that that's going to be the one that gets to snipe out characters, or possibly even individual models within a unit. Looks like this guy could have a small but terrible chance just to obliterate the leader of a squad. Otherwise, just for his Psychic powers, he also has the Jump. This one now happens once per turn at the end of the movement phase. Again, no hint of a Psychic test or warp charge value, and this one you can only do once per unit in your army per turn, so you can't just be jumping loads of Orky units all over the board. This one has a very big risk to it though. If you want to use the power, then you roll a dice. On a 2+, it teleports the Weirdboy and his units around the board as it does now, jumping over to a place that's greater than 9 inches away from any enemy units. The consequences of rolling a 1 though really do seem pretty harsh. If you roll a 1 for the ability, then the jump rule doesn't happen, and instead the unit takes d6 mortal wounds. That could easily be enough to kill a fair few boys. If he was part of a boys mob right now, in theory he could lose almost 50 points worth of models just literally from one bad roll. 1 out of 6 isn't even all that unlikely to come up, and unless they happen to have changed the way that command rerolls work, you wouldn't even be able to re-roll this. Seems very risky and maybe just a little bit orky in its way to backfire in a big way, but jumping units with teleport around the board is pretty powerful. I'm sure it's still going to be interesting enough. And bear in mind though that this is going to be locked to the one unit that you pick for this. You can't be selecting a different unit each turn for it. It's got to be the Weirdboy's own unit. Maybe just a bit less powerful than say if you're jumping a unit of boys one turn, then a unit of guns another turn to get some line of sight. Perhaps going to be a bit more limited in scope, like a fair few Psychic powers. Overall, I'd say that the changes are pretty interesting. Certainly looks like a super pared down Psychic phase, but still has some interesting abilities on each datasheet, just maybe a little bit less flexibility and no underlying mechanics that underpin them. I must admit, perhaps my first reaction is that I'm not entirely convinced that such drastic changes were really needed. As mentioned before, I feel like just anecdotally, it feels like the 8th and 9th edition psychic phases are perhaps the least complained about that I've virtually ever seen. I think the underlying mechanics of it are fairly good, with the interplay of casting versus denying. Obviously, it can get a bit broken like it did with Tyranids if Games Workshop cost all the points wrong, but the same could be said of anything. In terms of reasons for removing it, they said that it just didn't feel very interactive, and it could just be one player just watching the other player roll a whole bunch of exotic dice. I guess I can sort of see their point there, but I'm not really convinced that it's massively different to, say, the shooting phase. Again, that's going to be your opponent rolling a whole bunch of dice at you. Even if there is a little bit more engagement in rolling saves, most of the time you don't actually have the ability to change anything unless you're using command rerolls. I feel like the psychic phase at least had some interaction. Lots of armies had at least some psychic denial that they could try and throw a spanner in the works with, or maybe the odd stratagem. I feel like it kind of worked okay on the whole. Still though, definitely not to say that I'm massively negative about this new system. Psychics are still going to be going around doing what they do, just maybe with a bit less flexibility and without quite so many things to make them feel as unique. Certainly going to speed up the game a whole bunch. 0 psychic tests or denials to roll is a big deal. Lots of things are either just going to be extra weapons or extra buffs to the unit, though I guess it might just have a bit of a risk of making psychers feel just a little bit less special and more like any other model in your army. Just the lore behind them is they're getting things done with their brain magic as opposed to command abilities or directly shooting things with guns. Maybe moving away from mortal wounds for shooting attacks isn't the worst though, or at least not exclusively. I feel like that always did tend to skew psychic armies into being very good at dealing with very heavy tough targets and the same damage output just not having the same value against hordes of chaff. Otherwise, we currently have no idea if secondary missions and things are still surviving for competitive play or anything. Could mean that psychic secondaries go away. I suppose that might not be the worst thing in the world if it did though. It is a bit weird having a class of secondary objective that's only available to certain factions, and some armies are entirely locked out most of the time. And maybe a bit sad to see Perils of the Warp in itself go. Looks like most psychers will still experience some amount of risk though, either from overcharging their psychic powers or having risks built into the datasheet like the Orc Dad Jump. I guess in a similar sort of way, command point rerolls could still mitigate that hazardous rule if it still happens to be a roll to 1 to hit to take mortal wounds. Finally, it looks like psychic defense might largely focus on the damage of rules happening, as opposed to having major ways to interfere with the buffs or mobility things that psychic powers can do. Maybe some super focused anti-psychic units might get in the way of that sort of thing. Perhaps something like a Collector's Assassin might turn off all psychic abilities within 6 inches or something. But I'd guess for the vast majority of psychic defense in 40k, it will largely be those feel no pains against psychic attacks, and not interfere with buffs or other rules. I guess that broadly might be good news for armies like Thousand Sons or Grey Knights. You've got less chance of a cheeky deny just turning off an absolutely crucial part of your strategy. Let me know your thoughts though. What do you make of the big psychic changes? Really quite a lot to unpack here between a whole bunch of things disappearing and the way that the powers, buffs and risks will work. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep up the regular 40k videos. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, then I'd just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, which is what allows me to keep on making Warhammer 40k videos like this quite so regularly and just about every day. If you would like to support the creation of new videos like this, then any support on the page is enormously appreciated. The link is down in the video description if you're interested. Channel patrons do get a few advantages: seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.